I found out the same way everyone else did. A notification, a group chat, a message from someone I barely knew directed at people I had known for years. I read it once. Then I sat very still for a moment. Then I read it again. It was calm, factual, the kind of message that doesn't need to raise its voice because the content is doing all the work. There were screenshots attached, dates, conversations, the kind of detail that doesn't leave room for interpretation. In less than 2 minutes of reading, 18 months of my life rearranged themselves into a shape I finally recognized. The friends who had cooled, the invitations that had stopped, the looks I hadn't been able to explain, Claire's family and the warmth that had slowly, quietly drained out of every interaction. It hadn't been about me. It had never been about me. I put my phone down on the table. I didn't call anyone. I didn't respond to the message. I didn't reach out to Claire. I just sat in the quiet of my house and let the truth settle into the space where the confusion had been living for a very long time. To understand what that message meant, you need to understand what the 18 months before it felt like. I'm not someone who needs a lot from a relationship. I want to say that clearly, not as a defense, not as a setup for making Claire look worse by comparison, just as an accurate description of who I am and what I brought into that marriage. I am straightforward. I am consistent. I show up. I don't play games with people I love, and I don't have any particular interest in drama. I had always believed those qualities were enough, that a marriage built on honesty and steadiness and genuine care was a marriage built on solid ground. I believed that for a long time. Claire and I had met through mutual friends in our late 20s. The early version of us was good, genuinely good. She was warm and social and brought an energy to things that I think balanced something quieter in me. We made sense together, not in a fireworks way that burns fast, in the slower, more sustainable way that you hope actually lasts. We got married after 3 years together. The wedding was full of the people who would later become central to this story. Her family, who I had grown to genuinely like. Our mutual friends, a circle that had formed over several years of shared dinners and holidays and the ordinary accumulation of a social life built together. People I trusted. People I considered part of my life as much as hers. The early years of the marriage were fine. Not perfect. No marriage is perfect, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or not paying attention. But functional. Warm in the ways that matter. We had disagreements like every couple has disagreements. We had periods of distance and periods of closeness. The normal weather of a long-term relationship between two real people. I thought we were okay. Looking back now, I can see the places where the ground was less solid than I understood at the time. The conversations that ended before they were finished. The things Claire said she was fine with that I suspect she wasn't fine with. The slow accumulation of small, unsaid things that I didn't recognize as accumulation because each individual instance seemed too minor to address. I'm not trying to assign blame, evenly for the sake of appearing fair. I'm trying to be accurate. And the accurate version of our marriage includes the fact that I miss things, that I could have paid closer attention, that the steadiness I valued in myself probably looked like distance from certain angles. I accept that. What I don't accept, what I could not have anticipated and would not have believed if someone had told me, is what Claire chose to do with her unhappiness. Rather than bring it to me, rather than suggest counseling or a real conversation or any of the normal channels available to two adults in a marriage that isn't working, she took it somewhere else. I didn't know that yet. Not in year 3 or year 4. I was living inside what I believed was a normal marriage going through a difficult patch. I was present. I was trying. I was having the conversations I knew how to have and assuming that was enough. Meanwhile, in conversations I was not part of, conversations with her friends, her family, people from our shared circle, a version of me was being constructed that I would not have recognized. Controlling. That was the word I would eventually learn. Emotionally unavailable. The reason things weren't working. The problem. I had no idea. That is the thing I find most difficult to explain to people who haven't experienced it. not the betrayal itself. Betrayal is at least visible once you know it's there. But the period before you know. The months of living normally inside a situation that has already been decided in rooms you were never invited into. I was going to work every day, coming home, making dinner, having ordinary conversations with my wife, sleeping in the same bed, living what I believed was my actual life. And somewhere out there, the story of that life was being told without me. The first signs were subtle enough that I almost dismissed them. A friend, a man named James who I had known for several years through Claire's circle, became gradually harder to reach. Not suddenly, just slowly. Responses that used to come quickly started taking longer. Plans that used to form easily became vague. I noticed it, but told myself he was busy. People get busy. Then Claire's sister stopped calling. She and I had always had a warm relationship. She was easy to be around, direct and funny, and the kind of person who makes a family gathering better just by being in it. The calls had been regular. Then they weren't. Then they stopped. I mentioned it to Claire once. Said I hadn't heard from her sister in a while. Asked if everything was okay. Claire said she was fine. Just had a lot going on. I accepted that. Then I noticed it at a gathering, a birthday dinner for someone in the circle. The kind of event where the social temperature of a group is visible if you know how to read it. And I knew how to read it because I had been part of this circle long enough to know what normal felt like. This didn't feel normal. Nothing overt. Nothing I could point to directly. Just a collection of small things that added up to something I couldn't quite name. Eye contact that ended slightly too soon. Conversations that shifted when I arrived at them. The particular quality of warmth that is being performed rather than felt. I drove home from that dinner and sat with a feeling I couldn't fully articulate. Something was wrong. I didn't know what. I didn't know why. I just knew that the social world I'd been living inside had developed a texture it hadn't had before. And I had no explanation for it. I said nothing, not because I was avoiding it, but because I had nothing concrete to say. You cannot confront a feeling. You cannot bring evidence that doesn't exist yet to a conversation about something you can't fully name. So I watched, and I waited, and I kept living my life as normally as I could, while the low-level disorientation of knowing something was wrong without knowing what settled into the background of every day. I had no idea how long it had already been going on, and I had no idea how much further it had to go before I would finally understand what I was actually living inside. The shift became undeniable around month 4 of noticing it. Not a single event, just the point where the accumulation of small things crossed a threshold and became impossible to explain away individually anymore. James had effectively disappeared. Not just slow responses gone, the kind of absence that has a decision behind it. I sent one message asking directly if everything was okay between us. He replied briefly, said everything was fine, said he had just been busy. The message had the texture of someone who had been told what to say. Claire's family had become polite in the specific way that people become polite when warmth has been replaced by management. Her mother, a woman who had always been genuinely kind to me, now spoke to me at gatherings with a careful pleasantness that had nothing real underneath it. Every exchange felt like a performance of normalcy by someone who no longer felt normal around me. I had done nothing to any of these people. That was the part that sat in me most heavily. I could account for my own behavior completely. I had not had a falling out with James. I had not done anything to Claire's family. I had not changed in any way that would explain a coordinated cooling across an entire social circle, which meant the explanation was coming from somewhere else. I started to understand, slowly, without wanting to, that I had been talked about, not in the vague way that people mention each other in conversation, in a specific, sustained, deliberate way. The kind that shapes how people feel about someone before they have had any reason of their own to feel that way. I thought about Claire. I thought about the conversations she was having that I wasn't part of, the hours I was at work, the evenings she spent with friends, the family calls I wasn't on. I thought about what version of our marriage she might be presenting in those spaces, and I felt something cold and clarifying settle into my thinking. I didn't have proof. I want to be clear about that. At this point, I had nothing concrete, just a pattern of behavior across multiple people that pointed in one direction. But I knew, the way you know things that haven't been confirmed yet, but that your accumulated experience of a person has already answered for you. I said nothing to Claire, not because I was afraid of the conversation, because I had nothing to bring to it that she couldn't simply deny. She could look me in the eye and tell me I was imagining things, and I would have no answer for that. The pattern I had observed lived entirely in my own perception. None of it was writable on a piece of paper. So I did what I had always done when I didn't know what to do. I stayed steady. I kept living. I kept showing up to the marriage with the same consistency I had always brought to it. Not because I was in denial, but because the alternative was to start behaving in ways that would confirm whatever story was being told about me. I was not going to do that. If Claire was telling people I was controlling, then I was going to be the least controlling version of myself possible. If she was telling people I was difficult, then I was going to be easy, calm, present, not as a performance, just because those things were already true, and I was not going to let someone else's narrative pull me into becoming the character they had invented. That discipline was harder than it sounds. There were evenings where the weight of it was significant. Sitting across from Claire at dinner, having ordinary conversation, knowing or believing that she had spent her afternoon constructing a version of me for someone else's consumption. Holding all of that internally with nowhere to put it. I put it nowhere. I just held it. What I didn't know, what none of this made sense without, was the other part of the story. I didn't know about Thomas. Thomas was someone from the edge of our social circle. I knew him the way you know people in a mutual group, well enough to have a conversation at a gathering, not well enough to know anything real about his life. He had a long-term partner named Rachel. They had been together for years. They seemed solid in the way that couples seem solid from the outside. I had no reason to think about Thomas at all. He was simply part of the furniture of our social world, present at certain gatherings, friendly in the easy, low investment way of a mutual acquaintance. I did not know that he and Claire had been in a relationship for, by the time I'm telling you this, longer than I wanted to think about. I did not know that the narrative Claire had been building about me was not the story of an unhappy wife trying to be understood by the people around her. It was a cover story. Every word she had said about me, controlling, unavailable, the problem, was not a description of our marriage. It was a preparation for leaving it. She was building the case, laying the groundwork, making sure that when everything eventually came apart, the story was already in place and the people around us had already decided who to believe. She had been thorough about it. I will give her that. By the time I was sitting in rooms, feeling the coolness of people who had once been warm toward me, the jury had already delivered its verdict. I had already been found guilty of being the reason, the difficult one, the problem, and I hadn't even known there was a trial. I think about that period now with a specific kind of sadness that has nothing to do with anger. Not sadness for myself exactly, or not only for myself, sadness for the waste of it. The energy Claire had spent constructing something false rather than simply being honest. The relationships that had been quietly poisoned. The months I'd spent confused and slightly diminished inside a story I didn't know was being written. All of it unnecessary. All of it chosen. But that clarity came later. In the middle of it, I was still just a man living inside a marriage he didn't fully understand anymore, watching the world around him cool without knowing why. And somewhere across town, Rachel was living inside her own version of not fully understanding. Until the day she did. I don't know exactly when Rachel found out. I have never asked. It felt like the wrong question, the kind that serves curiosity rather than any real purpose. Whatever the mechanics of it were, she found out. And that fact was about to change everything for everyone involved, including me. What I know is that I had no warning. I was at home on an ordinary evening. Nothing particular was happening. I had made dinner. I was doing the quiet end-of-day things that fill the hours between work and sleep. Claire was somewhere in the house. Her presence had taken on a quality, by then, of two people sharing a space rather than a life. We were cordial. We were functional. But whatever had once connected us had thinned to something I could no longer pretend had substance. I had begun to accept, privately, that the marriage was ending. Not because of anything that had been said. Nothing had been said. But there's a point in a failing marriage where the truth of it lives in the air of the house regardless of whether either person has spoken it aloud. I had reached that point. I suspected Claire had too. I just didn't know what she was waiting for. My phone was on the table beside me. The notification came through like any other notification. The small sound that means someone has sent a message to a group. The group was one of those large mutual circle chats, the kind that forms over years of shared social life, and mostly sits quiet except for event planning and the occasional piece of shared news. I picked up the phone. The message was from Rachel. I knew who she was, Thomas's partner, a woman I had met a handful of times at group gatherings. Quiet, composed, the kind of person who listens more than she speaks. I had no particular close knowledge of her, and she had none of me. I read the message. It was not long. That was the first thing I noticed. It was not the sprawling, emotional outpouring of someone in acute pain, though she must have been in acute pain. It was measured, specific, written with a clarity that must have cost her an enormous amount to produce in that moment. She stated what had happened. Plainly, she named Thomas. She named Claire. She gave enough detail about the timeline that nobody reading it could construct an alternative explanation. And then she attached the screenshots. I sat with the phone in my hand and read it twice. And then something happened inside me that I did not expect. Not relief, not vindication, not the satisfaction of a narrative correcting itself. Something much quieter than any of those things. It felt like the moment when you have been standing in a dark room for a long time and someone finally turns a light on. Not dramatic, just illuminating. The room was the same room it had always been. The shapes were the same shapes. You could just finally see them. 18 months of confusion resolved itself in the space of a few minutes of reading. The cooling of James, Claire's family, and their careful politeness. The gatherings where the temperature was wrong. The low-level disorientation of knowing something was off without being able to name it. It hadn't been about me. She hadn't been describing our marriage to those people. She had been constructing an exit. I put the phone down. I sat in the quiet of the house for a long time. Claire was in the next room. I was aware of her presence the way you are aware of something you are not ready to address yet. Not avoidance, just the practical recognition that I needed a moment to let what I had just read settle into something I could hold steadily before I did anything with it. I did not go into the next room. I did not send a message to the group chat. I did not call anyone. I did not respond to Rachel's message in any way. I just sat. Somewhere across the mutual circle, other people were reading the same message. I thought about that, about James reading it, about Claire's sister, about the people who had sat in rooms with me and felt whatever Claire had told them they should feel about me. I thought about what they were feeling now, not with satisfaction. I want to be honest about that. There was no part of me that felt good about what Rachel had done. Not because it wasn't true, but because the truth arriving this way meant that Rachel was in pain. Real, serious pain. And that pain was real regardless of what it clarified for me. Someone had been genuinely hurt. That was not something I could feel good about. The group chat stayed still after Rachel's message. No responses. Not one. 12 people who were usually quick enough to reply to the most trivial things, and silence. The specific silence of a group of people who don't know what to say because there is nothing to say. Because the message had been clear enough and detailed enough and evidenced enough that the usual social machinery of deflection and ambiguity had nowhere to operate. The silence lasted 3 days. I went through those 3 days in a state of strange calm. Claire and I had a conversation the evening of the message. Brief. Quiet. Neither of us raised our voices. I told her I had seen the message. She didn't deny anything. There was a long silence between us that contained everything that didn't need to be said. Then we both went to bed, in the same house, not in the same room. I lay in the dark and thought about the years, not with bitterness, something more complex than that. Grief, I think, is the most accurate word. Not for the marriage, as it had turned out to be. For the marriage I had believed I was in. For the version of my life I had been living inside that had turned out to be something different than I understood. That kind of grief is specific. It's not just the loss of what was. It's the loss of what you thought was. The rewriting of a period of your own life that you thought you understood. I let myself feel that fully. I didn't manage it or reframe it or try to find a lesson in it before the feeling had finished. I just let it be as sad as it was. And on the morning of the fourth day after Rachel's message, my phone began to fill with private messages from people I had not heard from in months. The first message came from James. I saw his name on my screen and held the phone for a moment before opening it. It was long, longer than anything James had ever sent me in the years I had known him. He was not a man who wrote long messages. He was the type who communicated in short, direct sentences and considered that sufficient. The length of it alone told me something about where he was sitting when he wrote it. He said he owed me an apology. He said he had listened to things he should have questioned. He said he had pulled away from me based on a version of events he had accepted without ever asking for my side. He said he was sorry, not the performative kind of sorry that is really about making the person apologizing feel better. The real kind. The kind that names specifically what was done and doesn't dress it up. I read it twice. Then I replied. I told him I appreciated him reaching out. I told him I understood how these things happen, how a convincing narrative from someone you trust can shape your perception of someone else before you have any reason to question it. I told him there were no hard feelings. That last part was true. I want to be clear about that. It was not a performance of graciousness. I genuinely did not hold it against James in the way that would require forgiveness. He had been told something by someone he trusted. He had believed it. That is a human thing to do. The fault was not in his believing. It was in the telling. He responded with something simple and genuine. We left it there. More messages followed through that day and the next. Claire's sister wrote. That one was harder to read. Not because it was unkind, but because the warmth that had been missing from our interactions for over a year came flooding back through it, and the contrast was sharp. She said she had been told things that made her feel she should keep her distance. She said she wished she had called me directly rather than accepting a second-hand account. She said she was embarrassed. I told her she had nothing to be embarrassed about, that I was glad to hear from her, that I hoped we would stay in touch. I meant all of it. One by one the messages came, each one a variation on the same essential content. I should have asked. I should have questioned. I believed something I had no real evidence for. I'm sorry. I responded to every single one, with the same tone, the same genuine acceptance of the apology, the same absence of recrimination. Not because I was suppressing anything, but because recrimination would have required me to hold on to something I had already decided to put down. What would have served to make any of these people feel worse than they already felt? They hadn't done what Claire had done. They had been given a story, and they had believed it. That is not a moral failing. That is just how human beings process information from sources they trust. The one thing I did not do in any of those conversations was pile on Claire. Not once. Not in any of the private messages that came through during those days. Not when people gave me the obvious opening, and several did. People who were clearly angry on my behalf. People who wanted me to confirm the version of Claire that Rachel's message had revealed so they could feel their own anger was warranted. I did not give them that. Not because I was protecting Claire. I wasn't. But because I understood something clearly. Anything I said about Claire in those conversations would become part of a new narrative. And I had just spent 18 months on the wrong end of narrative. I had no interest in creating another one, even a true one, even one I had every right to create. Let the facts speak. Rachel had already made sure the facts were visible. I didn't need to add anything. I also did not contact Rachel directly. I thought about it. I thought about it carefully. She had done something that had changed my life in a significant way, and she had done it with no knowledge of me and no intention of helping me. She had been in pain, and she had done what people in pain sometimes do. She had released the truth because holding it had become unbearable. The fact that her release had also released me was incidental. I thought the most respectful thing I could do for Rachel was to leave her alone. She was dealing with the collapse of her own relationship. She was processing her own version of betrayal. She did not need me arriving in her messages with gratitude she hadn't been seeking. I hope she was okay. I still do. The days after the message were strange in a way that is difficult to describe. The external world had corrected itself. The people who had been cool were warm again. The invitations that had stopped began tentatively reappearing. The social circle that had been shaped around Claire's version of events was now reshaping itself around the truth. But inside my own house, the situation was unchanged. Claire and I were still living in the same space, still moving around each other with the careful, exhausted politeness of two people who have nothing left to say, but have not yet made the formal decision that there is nothing left to do. We had not had the real conversation yet. I had been waiting, not consciously, just instinctively, for the right moment. Not a confrontational moment. Not a moment of accusations or explanations or the relitigating of everything that had happened. Just the quiet, adult conversation that would acknowledge what was true and begin the process of dealing with it practically. I had been in this marriage with my whole self for years. I was going to leave it with the same integrity I had brought to it, however much that cost me. And the cost was becoming clearer with every day I sat in that house, waiting for the conversation that would end everything. The conversation happened on a Sunday morning. No particular reason for that day over any other. It just arrived the way these things arrive. Not scheduled, not announced, but suddenly present in the room in a way that made it clear it was happening now, whether either of us was ready. Claire was in the kitchen. I came in and made coffee. We stood in the same space for a moment, and something in the quality of the silence was different from the silences that had preceded it. Heavier, more deliberate, like a held breath. I sat down at the table. She sat down across from me. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I said, "I think we both know where we are." She looked at me. Something moved across her face, not guilt exactly, or not only guilt. Something more complicated. The expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is standing at the point where setting it down and picking it up further have become equally exhausting. She said yes. That was the beginning, and in some ways it was the whole of it. What followed was not a fight. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect fights in these moments. Raised voices, accusations, the dramatic release of everything that has been compressed. That is not what happened. What happened was a conversation between two people who had reached the end of something and were dealing with it as adults. I did not ask her to explain the affair. I did not ask her to account for the months of narrative she had built about me. I did not ask her why. Not because I didn't want to know, but because I had already understood enough of the why to know that her answer would not give me anything more useful than what I already had. She had been unhappy. She had made choices. Those choices had consequences that were now in motion. That was the whole shape of it. What we talked about instead were the practical things. The house, the finances, what the process of separation would look like. Two people who had built a life together, going through the methodical, painful task of figuring out how to unbuilding it cleanly. She cried at some point. I noticed it and felt something, not satisfaction, not indifference. Something closer to sorrow, not for what she had done, for what we had both lost, for the version of this that hadn't happened, the version where she had simply been honest with me about being unhappy and we had dealt with it directly and whatever ending was inevitable had happened without all of the rest of it. I didn't say that out loud. Some things are true and also not useful to say. We finished the coffee. We finished the conversation. We agreed on next steps. I called a lawyer the following week. The legal process was what legal processes are, slow, detailed, occasionally frustrating, ultimately necessary. I engaged with it professionally. I kept my emotions out of it to the extent that was possible. I made decisions based on what was fair and what would allow both of us to move forward cleanly rather than what felt satisfying in the short term. The settlement was reasonable. Neither of us came away from it with everything we wanted. Both of us came away from it with what we needed. I moved into a new place 6 weeks after that Sunday morning conversation. The first night there, I sat in an empty living room with a takeaway container and a single lamp I had brought from the old house, and I looked at the bare walls for a while. It was quiet, deeply quiet, the specific quiet of a space that hasn't been lived in yet. I didn't find it sad, or not only sad. There was something underneath the sadness that felt, and I want to find the right word here, spacious, like a room with the furniture cleared out. More capacity than there had been before. More possibility. I ate my dinner. I went to bed on a mattress on the floor because the bed frame hadn't arrived yet. I slept better than I had in months. The social world around me was still recalibrating during this period. The messages had settled into a new normal. James and I had spoken properly, a real conversation, not just the exchange of apologies and acceptances. We had coffee once. It was a little careful at first, the way things are after a rupture, even a repaired one. But underneath the carefulness, the friendship was still there. The same basic person I had known before any of this. Some of the other relationships didn't fully recover. Not dramatically. Nobody was hostile. But some things that have been absent for long enough stop feeling like absences and start feeling like the natural state of things. A few of the friendships that had cooled stayed at the cooler temperature even after the reason for the cooling had been removed. I accepted that without trying to reverse it. If the warmth between me and someone had required Claire's active maintenance to exist, then perhaps it had never been quite what I thought it was. Perhaps some of those relationships had always been more hers than mine, and I had simply been included in them by proximity. That realization was not painful. Just clarifying. I was beginning to understand that the life coming into view on the other side of all of this was going to be smaller than the life I had been living. Smaller social circle. Fewer of the easy, warm, low-investment connections that had filled the edges of my world. But more real. That distinction was starting to matter to me more than I had expected it to. I thought about Rachel occasionally during those weeks. I had heard through the residual channels of the mutual circle that she and Thomas had ended. That his attempts to manage the fallout of her message had failed in the way that attempts to manage the unmanageable always fail. That the relationship was over. I felt something about that. Genuine sadness for her. She had done nothing wrong. She had been in the same position I had been in. Living inside a story she didn't know was being told. The difference was that she had found out differently and responded differently, and the consequences for her had been more immediately visible. I hoped she was building something good on the other side of it. I hoped that without knowing her, just as one person who had been in the wreckage of something to another. Claire and I had no contact after the legal process concluded. Not by agreement exactly, just by the natural gravity of two people who have dealt with what needed to be dealt with and have no remaining business with each other. She existed somewhere in the world going through whatever she was going through. I wish her nothing bad. I also wished her nothing, which is its own kind of distance. The specific distance of someone who has been removed from your emotional life, not through hatred, but through the quiet withdrawal of investment. I had invested in Claire completely for years. That investment was gone now. Not destroyed, just withdrawn. Redirected toward the life I was building in the empty apartment with the bare walls and the mattress on the floor. And that life, quiet and small and genuinely mine, was beginning to take a shape I recognized, one I could actually see myself living in. The first year after the marriage ended was the quietest year of my adult life. Deliberately so. I had come out of a period where my social world had been large and managed and shaped by forces I hadn't fully understood while they were operating. The mutual circle, the group chats, The gatherings where the temperature was always being set by someone, and I was always being measured against a version of myself I had never agreed to. I wanted none of that for a while, so I contracted, deliberately and without apology. I saw James regularly, a small number of other people whose presence in my life had survived the full test of everything that had happened. People I now knew, with the specific certainty that only comes from having been through something difficult together or alongside each other, were genuinely there. Everyone else I let recede naturally. No announcements, no unfollowing or blocking, or any of the performative severance that people sometimes use to signal a new chapter. I just stopped investing in the things that didn't have real substance. Stopped showing up to the gatherings that were really just proximity without connection. Stopped maintaining relationships that had always required more energy from me than they returned. The circle that remained was small enough to count easily. It was the right size. There is something that happens when you stop filling your life with the wide, shallow version of connection. The space that opens up is initially uncomfortable. It can feel like loneliness even when it isn't. But if you sit in it long enough, it stops feeling like an absence and starts feeling like clarity. Like the difference between a room that is cluttered and a room that is clean. I learned to value the clean room. My work became more central during that year than it had been in a long time. Not as a distraction, I was deliberate about not using it as a place to hide from the harder feelings, but as something genuinely absorbing. I had more capacity for it now, more mental space. The low-level noise that had been running in the background of my life for 18 months, the confusion, the social disorientation, the quiet grief of feeling the world cool around you without understanding why, was gone. The silence it left behind was useful. I thought more clearly. I worked more effectively. I made decisions with a steadiness that I think had always been in me, but had been harder to access when so much of my energy was being spent on things I couldn't see clearly. About 8 months after the separation, I had a conversation with Claire's sister. We had stayed in touch, tentatively at first, then more genuinely as the months passed. She was one of the people whose warmth had returned fully after Rachel's message and had not receded back to the careful politeness of the preceding months. I appreciated that. It would have been easier for her to let the relationship quietly disappear. I was her sister's ex-husband, and there was no obvious reason to maintain the connection. She maintained it anyway, on her own initiative, without making a performance of it. We had coffee one afternoon, and at some point the conversation became more honest than our conversations had usually been. She said, and I am paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact words, that she had known for a while that something wasn't right in what she was hearing about me. That certain things Claire had said hadn't fully added up, but that she hadn't trusted that instinct enough to question it. She said she wished she had trusted it. I told her that the instinct to trust the people we love over our own uncertainty is not a flaw. That Claire had been deliberate and consistent in what she had built. That it would have taken real courage to push back against it, and that she shouldn't hold herself responsible for not having done so. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she was glad I hadn't become bitter about it. I thought about that on the drive home. Bitter. I had thought about bitterness during those 18 months. Had felt the pull of it, the particular appeal of a clean, simple anger that organizes everything that happened into a story where you are entirely right and someone else is entirely wrong. There is comfort in that story. It is easier than the complicated version. But bitterness requires ongoing maintenance. You have to keep feeding it. Keep returning to the grievance and refreshing it so it stays alive. And everything you feed it with is energy that belongs somewhere else. I had decided early, not in a dramatic moment of resolution, just quietly, in the ordinary way of someone who has thought something through, that I was not going to be bitter. Not about Claire. Not about the friends who had believed her. Not about the months of being publicly reduced to a character I didn't recognize. None of it had broken anything in me that I valued. And all of it had clarified things I needed clarifying. I knew who had been there. I knew who hadn't. I knew what real friendship looked like versus the version that depends on favorable circumstances. I knew the difference between a social world built on genuine connection and one built on managed proximity. I knew myself better than I had before any of it. That knowledge had cost something real, but was mine now, permanently, in the way that things you earn through difficulty become permanently yours in a way that things that come easily never quite do. The second year was fuller than the first. Not louder, just fuller. The quiet life I had been building had developed a texture and a rhythm that felt genuinely like mine. Work that I was engaged in. A small number of friendships that had real substance. The ordinary pleasures of a life lived without the low-level tension of not quite understanding the ground you were standing on. I met someone toward the end of that year. I'm not going to go into detail about that because this story is not about her. It is about everything that came before her. What I will say is that the experience of building something new after losing something completely had given me a clarity about what I actually valued in a relationship that I had not had in my 20s or early 30s. I knew what I was looking for. I knew what I would not accept. I knew the difference between the feeling of genuine connection and the feeling of comfortable proximity. Those things matter. The cost of learning them had been high, but I was glad I knew them. I think about Rachel sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. Usually when I find myself moving through a day that feels genuinely good. The specific quality of a day where everything is in its right place and the life around you feels like it actually fits. I think about the fact that I would not be here without what she did. She had no intention of helping me. She was in pain, and she released the truth because the alternative was to keep it inside her, and the weight of it had become unbearable. I was incidental to that decision. A stranger whose name happened to be entangled in the same facts she was releasing into the world. She gave me my life back without knowing she was doing it. I hope her life is good. I hope she found her way to a version of things that feels like it fits the way mine now fits. She earned that, in the way that people who go through something they didn't choose and survive it with their dignity intact always earn whatever comes after. The mutual circle exists somewhere in the background of my life now. Distant, untended. I am aware of it the way you are aware of a neighborhood you used to live in. You know it is there, you pass through it occasionally, but it no longer feels like home. That is fine. Home is somewhere else now. A smaller place, a quieter one, with people in it whose presence has been tested in the only way that actually counts, by the experience of a period when showing up cost them something. Those people are enough. They have always been enough. I just needed everything else to fall away before I could see that clearly. The thing I carry from all of it, the single thing that has stayed with me more than any other, is simple enough to say in one sentence. You never really know the shape of your life until something removes the parts that didn't belong there. If this story sat with you, leave a comment. Tell me what it brought up. I read every one. And if you want to hear another one, the next story is already waiting. I'll see you there.